Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. My name is Mordecai the Hunter, and today we are on the bench to talk about my Ruger Wrangler in 22 long rifle. These pistols were technically released in 2019, but really came to my attention in 2020 when my local club opened up a 22 category for adults to help mitigate ammo and component costs. I have personally put several hundred rounds through these pistols on cowboy action stages, but I also like to bring them out for new shooters or just general plinking. And thankfully, the adult 22 category has stuck around, so now I use them for folks that want to give the sport a try, but aren't quite sure if they're ready to make the cash investment. So, not to put the cart before the horse here, but I do really like this pistol, and I wanted to share why I like it. I also have a couple of gripes, which I'll point out as we go along here. Now, before we get too far along, I will say that I added these brass covers to the front blade because I have them on my main match pistols and I really like them for getting on targets quicker. There are several companies that make these, but I bought this specific pair from On Target Sights, which I'll link in the description. But that's the only major modification I've made to these guns. I did try some lighter springs at one point, but I couldn't get them to work reliably, so if I was doing it again, I'd just stick to the factory springs. On that same note, one of the really cool things about this revolver is how close it is to a normal Vaquero. In fact, almost all the modifications you could make to a single 6 or Vaquero can also be done to these guns. And I do know some folks that spend a lot of money to make them as close to their main match revolvers as possible. So I guess if you were looking for something that you could upgrade in the future, this is a good candidate. But with a 22 pistol, I think you're more likely interested in the value proposition. Ruger has an excellent reputation for quality firearms, especially among cowboy revolvers. So when I found out they had released a budget-friendly 22 revolver, I went to the next gun show looking for a pair, and was able to pick these up for around $200 a piece. And you know, even though they're supposed to be cheap, they don't feel cheap. Looking at the website, these weigh in at 30 ounces, which compared to other 22 revolvers seems pretty good. A Ruger single 6 with the same barrel length is only 3 ounces more. Or on the other hand, a Ruger Bearcat is 6 ounces less. So you'll probably notice a difference compared to your 40-something ounce Vaquero. I'm just saying it's not that big a jump from a more expensive 22 revolver. If this is your first revolver, 30 ounces is about the same as a loaded Glock 19. If this is your first pistol, it's a good weight. Moving on, the Cerakote finish seems to have held up pretty well. We do have some wear here at the tip of the barrel from holstering and the usual cylinder ring from the bolt rubbing. But other than that, no major chips or anything. This gun specifically had a long screw in the front of the frame for some reason, which is why this other line is here. But I ground that down and it's fine now. Honestly, I don't think I remember any extra drag, I just noticed it when the line appeared. The frame itself isn't completely smooth, which you can see if you look really closely at the trigger guard and here under the bottom of the frame, but from afar it's fine. It does still have the stupid instruction manual warning here, but it's mostly hidden on the bottom of the barrel next to the ejector housing, which is nice. I do like that they have upgraded all of the frame screws to Torx heads, which makes them harder to strip, but the one screw that seems to fall out all the time is still a flathead. And that's this little guy holding the ejector housing onto the barrel. So, not sure why they skipped that one, but maybe it'll get updated in future productions. There are 2 more flathead screws that I can see, one for the crosspin that holds the cylinder pin in place, and of course the screw on the grips. But I've never had those screws back out and fling a spring across the range or anything. Never to be found again. Anyway, the grip pattern is the same as the more expensive single 6 grips, so you can switch these out if you want to. But honestly, I really like these plastic grips that came with them. They have a thin profile, which is my preference, and the texture is actually really great. The cylinder and frame are slightly smaller than a new Vaquero, but it still feels great in my hand. And actually, I noticed that the smaller frame makes it easier to reach the hammer one-handed. With a new Vaquero, you really need lowered hammers to shoot gunfighter or duelist, but that's not a problem with the Wrangler. And the hammer itself also has some nice checkering, so you can get a good grip on it with whatever thumb you prefer. Up here at the top we have a nice wide notch for the rear sight, and of course my brass front sights fill that up nice, but the standard blade works just fine as well. I will say that I really like the Ruger sight picture over Colt clones because you can actually see them with the hammer down. With most Colt clones, you can't see the sights until you pull the hammer back. And I'm not sure how much it helps my shooting, but it does make me feel better. The barrel here is 4.62 inches, which is a pretty desirable length for most cowboy shooters. I'm particular to 5.5 inch myself, but having a shorter barrel didn't mess me up trying to reholster or anything. Moving on to the inside here, we will start with the transfer bar safety, which, if you're unfamiliar, is the mechanism which allows you to load 6 rounds into this firearm safely. The transfer bar moves into position when you pull the trigger and fills the gap between the firing pin and the hammer. When you're not pulling the trigger, the transfer bar lowers, so the hammer isn't actively resting on the firing pin. This way, if you drop the gun or hit the hammer somehow forcefully, the round under the hammer doesn't go off. This revolver does not have the traditional 4 clicks of the single action army, since the safety click is basically done for you by the transfer bar. If I go really slow, I think I can get 3, but 2 and 3 are so close together that you really don't notice unless you're going slow like this. The hammer pull is pretty consistent over the entire cycle, which is due to the coil mainsprings that Ruger uses, and is the same as what you would find in your Blackhawk or Vaquero. I do have the handles pulled off this other gun so that you can see what I'm talking about. More traditional Colt clone revolvers use a leaf spring, kind of like this one. Anyway, the loading gate is pretty stiff on this thing, which isn't a super big deal since it doesn't affect the actual shooting part, but I can see it being a pain in the neck after a while. Opening the loading gate drops the bolt and allows the cylinder to rotate. This is what's called a free spin cylinder because it can rotate in either direction, which can be more convenient for loading and unloading. When you're done putting in your rounds, you close the loading gate again and the bolt locks up. When you're done firing, you open the gate and use the ejector rod to push the spent casings out. I did read somewhere that this is a dedicated long rifle platform, so you can't just order a 22 mag cylinder like you can with a Heritage or whatever. But I've never needed a 22 mag and I wouldn't use it for cowboy anyway, so it wasn't a big deal for me at the time. I do think that Ruger has put out a second iteration called the Super Wrangler, which allows for this kind of thing, but again, not my jam. Okay, so how did it work out for cowboy action? So the first thing I forgot about stock Rugers is that you can't pull the trigger until the hammer is back. Most of the folks that shoot cowboy have the transfer bars removed to smooth up the action and remove a possible point of failure. And in doing so, you can draw the gun with the trigger held down and just work the hammer to fire rounds, which is my preferred method. Not a big deal, just something different. Now, it did take me a while to get used to a heavier hammer spring. I tried a few lighter springs and ran into reliability problems, so I gave that up pretty quick. The way to pull was just different enough that I wouldn't pull the hammer back all the way in the middle of a string, so the cylinder wouldn't complete the rotation and then the hammer would fall in between the rounds somewhere and I'd have to go around the cylinder again. This was really a problem while I was trying to go fast with 2 hands, but if I was really deliberate about pulling the hammer back before pulling the trigger, it went off every time, so I knew it was my fault and not the gun. So rather than fight it, I took the opportunity to dip my toes into the gunfighter category, and I did really enjoy that. I'm definitely not as fast in that category, so I ended up coming back to two-handed afterwards, but it was a fun experience and I highly recommend it if you have any desire to try. And like I said earlier, the reduced size made it easier to shoot these one-handed, so I was able to try it out without having to drop cash on lowered hammers or anything. So that was nice. Something I discovered about myself is that I am not a fan of the free spin cylinder. Now, I wrote and rewrote this script several times trying to justify this position. I feel like it's easier to teach the old load one, skip one, COLT method, and the cylinder indexes when you turn it with a super satisfying click to let you know that everything is lined up correctly. With a free spin, you have to turn the cylinder after closing the loading gate to make sure that the bolt locks up, and I don't always trust a new shooter to put the empty chamber under the hammer. But at the end of the day, I think it just comes down to preference. You still have to teach someone how to load properly, and at least with the transfer bar, if they do make a mistake, it's just a click in the middle of their string on the firing line and not a bang on the loading table or somewhere unsafe. So I guess it's just change I'll need to embrace. I guess if someone from the Ruger design team was listening and open to advice, it would be super cool to have a way to visually check the rounds like you can with the centerfire revolvers. Specifically, I know you can mill off some of the cylinder on the single sixes, but that does not work with these pistols due to how they're designed. So if you have a mill, don't try it, and if you're a Ruger rep, maybe add that to the R&D list. Okay, so at the end of the day, are they worth it? And I would say absolutely. This pistol represents an amazing value in terms of quality and performance, and they allowed me to keep shooting when times were tough and even try a new category. Even though I don't use these for cowboy any longer, they are still the first guns I grab when I'm bringing new shooters to the range, or I just want to plink around for a little while. They are super approachable for folks of all ages and backgrounds, and I don't have to worry about the cost of ammo or collecting brass or anything like that. If you're considering them for cowboy, this is a great option for anyone who wants to play the game but doesn't want to invest a lot or deal with the cost of ammo. You won't be able to compete at the state or national level, but that's probably not your priority right now. And don't worry about the couple of things I whined about, because that probably won't affect you anyway. Okay, I guess that's all I have to say about that. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you all on the range.
Pretty day for making things right.
Stand by!